He sat up slowly, letting the blanket fall away, and placed his bare feet on the wide plank floor. One board, the one just beside the bed, gave a low creak that had been part of his mornings for as long as he could remember. The air inside the cottage was cool but not cold, carrying the faint, clean smell of whitewash and old timber. He crossed to the washstand, a plain wooden table holding a glazed bowl and a pitcher of water he had drawn from the pump the evening before. The water was chill as he splashed it on his face, his hands moving in the slow, practiced way of someone who has no need to hurry. A linen cloth hung from a peg, and he pressed it to his cheeks and the back of his neck before smoothing down his hair with his fingers. Dressing was a quiet sequence of small, deliberate motions. First, his linen shirt, its collar softened by many washings until it lay flat without a single crease. Then a pair of wool trousers in a muted brown, held up by braces that he slipped over his shoulders one at a time. He pulled on 2 pairs of socks because the summer mornings carried a dampness that settled in the bones despite the season, and then his leather boots, which had been oiled and polished so often that the leather had taken on the shape of his own feet. The laces were long, and he wound them carefully around the top eyelets before tying a knot that would not slip. Over everything he put on a simple jacket of dark serge, its pockets empty except for a folded handkerchief and the loft key, which he touched with his thumb to make sure it was there. He took a flat cloth cap from a hook by the door and settled it on his head, the brim low enough to shade his eyes even though the sun was not yet strong. The cottage door opened onto the lane with a latch that lifted easily and without noise. He stepped outside, pausing on the stone threshold, while the cool air met his cheeks and the backs of his hands. The fog was not a heavy fog, but a thin, even veil that hung in the lane at the height of the rooftops, blurring the outlines of the cottages opposite, until they became soft shapes of grey and brown. The cobblestones underfoot were damp from the night, dark as river stones after rain, and the few weeds that grew in the cracks held tiny beads of moisture that caught the faint glow of the half-risen sun. Everything was motionless, the air so still that the smoke rising from the baker's chimney a little way down the lane climbed in a perfectly straight column, thinning only when it reached the height of the church tower and lost itself in the whiteness above. He closed the cottage door behind him, testing the handle once to be sure it had caught, then turned left and began to walk. His footsteps on the cobblestones made a soft, dry scrape that sounded large in the quiet, a sound that was there and then gone, swallowed by the fog as soon as it was made. The shutters of the houses he passed were all still closed, their slats fitting together so tightly that no lamplight showed through, each window a blind eye turned toward the day that was only just arriving. He walked past the well, its wooden cover clamped down for the night, and past the yard where the cobbler worked, the bench outside empty and the awning furled. The baker's oven was the first sign of the village waking, though he could not see the ovens themselves. A warm, yeasty scent blended with the cool, damp smell of the fog drifting out from an open door hidden around a corner. The scent was the same every morning, a reminder of dough rising in the dark hours while everyone slept, of flour dust hanging in a warm room, of the first loaves being slid onto the hot brick floor. He walked on, and the smell gradually gave way to the cleaner, greener scent of the open air that lay just ahead. A sound reached him then, the irregular clop of a horse's hooves and the low rumble of iron-rimmed wheels turning over stone. From a side lane that he could not see into, the village milk cart emerged, a solid 2-wheeled wagon drawn by a broad dappled horse whose heavy coat shone with damp. Steel churns rattled gently in the bed of the cart, their lids sealed tight, and the driver, wrapped in a dark coat with the collar turned up, sat hunched on the small wooden seat. The horse's breath came in soft white puffs that merged with the fog around its head. As the cart passed in front of him, the driver lifted one hand in a silent greeting. Not a wave, but simply the raising of fingers from the rim of the cart's side, and the keeper lifted his own hand in return. Neither spoke. The cart rounded the bend by the baker's yard and was gone, the sound of the wheels growing fainter and fainter until it was only a memory of a rhythm under the stillness. He continued on, past the last of the cottages, to where the lane widened out beside the old churchyard. The church itself was no more than a dark mass in the fog, its stone walls patched with moss, its bell invisible in the tower. Linden trees lined the path, their broad heart-shaped leaves hanging perfectly motionless in the damp air. every leaf coated with a fine cold film of dew. The scent of the lindens was faint, a soft floral note that would not fully emerge until the sun had been on them for an hour. He passed the iron gate of the churchyard, the bars cold even from a few inches away, and then the cobblestones ended, and the track became a grassy path that sloped gently downward toward the meadows. The fog was thinner here, beginning to lift as the first real light of the morning seeped through. The grass was long on the verges, brushed with dew that soaked into the toes of his boots within the first dozen steps, darkening the leather in uneven patches. The track curved around a stand of alders, their trunks rising pale and straight out of the mist like the masts of ships anchored in a grey sea. And then the land opened out into the wide, flat meadow where the pigeon loft stood. The loft sat at the meadow's edge, where the grass was cropped short by the village sheep and the ground beneath it was packed down to a firm, clean surface. It was a long, low building made of vertical planks that had weathered over decades to a soft silver grey, the wood grain raised and textured where rain and sun had worked on it, season after season. The roof was pitched at a shallow angle, covered with tiles of baked clay that had taken on a dark, moss-edged hue. Under the eaves, small rectangular ventilation slits had been cut, their edges darkened where generations of pigeons had brushed past. The door was a single heavy plank of timber, painted long ago in a faded green that had peeled back in curls, showing the grey wood beneath. Against the wall beside the door sat an upturned wooden crate, its surface worn smooth from use, and a birch broom rested in the corner between the wall and the door frame. No other structure stood nearby, only the meadow stretching away into the fog, the far-off line of a hedgerow barely visible as a smudge of darker grey. He stopped a few paces from the door and let his gaze travel slowly over the building, checking by habit that the ventilation shutters were still closed as he had left them the evening before, that no branch had fallen, that the grass around the foundation was undisturbed. The air was entirely still now, without even the faint drift that had moved the fog earlier. It held the scent of dry straw, of old wood warmed by the coming sun, of the faint clean ammonia that belonged to any well-kept pigeon loft. Somewhere inside the building, a single pigeon gave a soft, throaty coo, the sound muffled by the thick plank walls, a sound that was answered a moment later by another, and then silence returned. He stood for a long moment, feeling the weight of the key in his pocket, watching the fog thin inch by inch as the sun climbed behind the alders, and then he stepped forward, pulled the key from his jacket, and moved toward the door. The keeper stood before the loft door with the key already in his hand, though he did not recall taking it from his pocket. The familiar weight of the iron key rested across his palm, its surface darkened by years of handling until the metal had grown smooth and almost warm against his skin. He looked at the door as he had looked at it every morning, noting the way the green paint had peeled a little more since the spring, revealing a patch of grey wood shaped like the coast of some distant country on a map. The morning fog had left the planks damp, so that the whole surface was a shade darker than it would be by noon, and tiny droplets clung to the grain lines like beads of sweat on skin. He put the key into the lock, a simple iron mechanism that had been fitted when the loft was built by his father's generation, and turned it with a single clean motion that produced a low, solid clunk from somewhere deep inside the timber. The sound was brief and final, the kind of sound that says something has been opened that was securely closed. He withdrew the key and placed it back in his jacket pocket, then put both hands flat against the door, one near the iron latch and the other lower down where a cross-brace gave him a comfortable grip. The wood was cool under his fingers, rough where the grain had risen, and he could feel the faint vibration of some small movement inside, perhaps a bird shifting on its perch. He pushed, not hard, but steadily, and the door began to move inward with a soft scrape that ran along the bottom edge where the plank met the stone threshold. It was a familiar sound, the friction of wood against stone, worn smooth by uncountable mornings. A sound that announced the beginning of the day as clearly as any bell. The door swung inward in a wide arc, pushing a wave of air before it that carried the interior scent out into the open, and the keeper stepped aside just enough to let the door move past him before following it inside. The change in the air was immediate and whole. Outside had been cool and clean, carrying the water smell of fog and the green note of the meadow, but inside the loft the air was warmer by several degrees. enclosed and still, thick with a blend of scents that had been steeping together through the night. Dry straw was the foundation of it, the sweet, dusty fragrance of oat and wheat stems that had been cut and bundled and stacked, releasing their last summer into the dim space. Over that lay the dry, clean scent of old timber. Cedar mostly, but also pine in the newer perches. Wood that had absorbed decades of this same air and gave it back slowly, a little at a time, as if it were breathing. And woven through both was the faint, sharp note of ammonia from the droppings of the birds, not unpleasant or strong, just present, a clean animal scent that belonged to the place as much as the straw and the wood. Together, these three elements made a single smell that the keeper knew better than any other, the smell of the loft, the smell of home going at the end of the day and of beginning again in the morning. He stopped just inside the doorway and let the door rest against its stop. A wooden block fixed to the wall that caught the edge softly and held it open. His boots were now on the floorboards of the loft, which were wide planks of pine laid directly over the earth, and they gave a low, solid sound as his weight settled onto them. The floor was swept clean from the previous evening, though a few stray bits of chaff and a single small grey feather lay near the threshold, brought in perhaps on the hem of his own jacket the day before. He did not move further yet, but stood still, letting his eyes adjust from the pale morning brightness outside to the softer filtered light within. The loft was not dark, but it was a different kind of brightness, a gentle dimness that had its own quality of seeing. Light entered through the high ventilation slats that ran along both long walls just under the roofline, narrow horizontal openings cut at an angle so that rain would not enter, and through these the thin morning sun fell in long, distinct beams that looked almost solid, like planes of pale gold glass leaning across the space. Each beam held in it a slow, constant drift of dust motes, tiny specks of chaff and straw particles that had been stirred up by the opening door and were now settling again, moving in ways that seemed both random and governed by some unseen current. The dust motes rose and fell and drifted sideways, catching the light and then leaving it, a silent dance that went on whether anyone watched or not, and the keeper watched it now, a small daily pleasure that never grew old. The loft stretched away from him in a long rectangle, perhaps 12 paces deep and half as wide, the roof sloping down to the side walls, so that the very edges of the room were low enough to touch with an outstretched hand. Down the centre ran a clear aisle, floored with the same pine boards, and on both sides, rising in tiers from waist height to just under the eaves, were the perches. The perches were simple lengths of smooth cedar, each about the thickness of a broom handle, set into horizontal rails that ran the full length of the building. They were arranged in 4 long rows on each side, and along each row were shallow dividers that marked out individual spaces, so that every bird had its own small station. The wood of the perches had been worn to a soft polish by countless feet, gripping and shifting over time, and the colour had deepened to a rich honey brown where the cedar oils had been worked into the grain. Below the perches, at floor level, were the nest boxes, small open-fronted cubicles built of pine and lined with clean straw, some of them containing pressed straw nest bowls that were the shape of a cupped pair of hands. A few of the boxes held hens that were sitting on eggs, and these birds were visible only as low, rounded shapes of feather, with the occasional glint of a dark eye. The pigeons themselves were everywhere, a quiet population arranged in rows like books on a library shelf. Most of them were still asleep, their heads drawn down into their shoulders, so that the smooth curve of the back merged into the breast without any clear division. Each bird a neat, compact shape of feather and warmth. Their plumage showed every shade of grey that exists between charcoal and pearl, with here and there a flash of iridescent green and purple across a neck, catching the light like oil on dark water. A few birds had their heads turned and their beaks tucked backward into the feathers between the wings, a position that made them look like small, contented stones. Others faced forward, eyes half closed, the thin membrane blinking slowly across the dark iris as they hovered in the shallow edge of waking. The keeper let his gaze move along the rows, counting not by number but by position, checking that each familiar shape was where it ought to be, that no perch stood empty that had been occupied the night before. All was in order. As he stood there, a sound began, so low at first that it was barely separate from the silence. A single pigeon in the 3rd row from the left stirred, lifting its head and stretching its neck forward in a slow, sinuous movement, and then it made a soft coo, a low, throaty note that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the bird's body, not a song, but a statement, a simple recognition of the day. The note hung in the still air for a moment, and then, as if it had been a signal, another bird 2 perches away answered with the same sound, and another, until a soft, desultory chain of coos ran along the rows, each one slightly different in pitch and length, a conversation that asked for nothing and expected no reply. The keeper listened to this sound as he might listen to the first few drops of rain, not as a meaningful message, but as a texture of the morning, as much a part of the loft's awakening as the opening of the door. Mixed with the coos were other, smaller sounds, the dry rustle of feathers being shaken out, the soft thump of a bird landing back on its perch after a brief flutter, the faint scratch of a claw adjusting its grip on the smooth cedar. These noises came and went, never rising beyond a murmur, layering over one another in a gentle weave that filled the space without disturbing its essential quiet. After a time he took a step forward, then another, moving into the aisle at a pace that was slow enough not to startle. His boots made a low, regular sound on the boards, a sound the birds knew well and did not fear. As he walked, he looked to the left and right, checking the condition of the floor beneath each row of perches, where overnight droppings had collected in small piles directly below the birds' resting positions. The droppings were dry and chalky, mostly white with a dark center where the moisture had long since evaporated into the loft air, and they sat on the planks in patterns that told him which birds had remained still through the night and which had moved restlessly from spot to spot. He noted a broken feather here, a single small one, its quills still glossy, and a scattering of chaff from a nest box where some late-night rearranging had taken place. These were the ordinary signs of life that accumulated in the quiet hours, and he read them without thinking, as a man might read the morning sky for the weather. At the far end of the aisle, against the back wall, stood the things he would need. The water bucket was a plain galvanized pail, its sides muffled with the ghost marks of many fillings, the handle looped down against the rim. Beside it leaned the birch broom, its handle worn smooth in the middle where his right hand habitually gripped, its bristles compressed and splayed from use but still even enough to sweep cleanly. A small stack of fresh straw bales, 3 of them, sat on a low wooden pallet to keep them off the floor, their golden color bright even in the dim light, each one tied with twine that had been opened and then loosely retied. The straw smelled of the field it had come from, a sunnier, broader smell than the enclosed scent of the loft, and he caught it now as he approached, a brief reminder of the hay harvest and the hot days of cutting and turning. Against the wall also rested a coil of new sisal rope, a spare latch for the trapdoor, and a clay pot filled with the soft grey sand he used for grit. Everything was in its place, left ready the night before, waiting for the routine to pick up the thread. He reached the back wall and turned to face the length of the loft again, now seeing it from the far end with the open door, a rectangle of pale light at the other side. The sun had climbed a little further while he had been standing, and the beams from the high slats had shifted their angle, falling now on different patches of the floor and perches, moving across the space as slowly as the hour hand of a clock. The pigeons had settled again, their brief stirring over, and most had resumed their sleep positions, though a handful remained awake, watching him with the steady, unconcerned gaze of creatures that have never known harm. Their eyes were like small polished beads, orange and gold and deep ruby red, set in circles of bare skin that varied in color from white to pale pink. In the quiet, the sound of their breathing was just barely audible, a subtle rise and fall that blended with the soft creaking of the timber walls as the sun began to warm the outside planks. The keeper stood for another long moment, and in that moment he was not thinking of anything that could be put into words. He was simply there, in the old wooden building with the birds and the light and the smells, held in the pause that comes after opening a door and before beginning the work. The broom would be lifted, the pail would be filled, the sweep would begin, but not yet. For now, there was only the loft exactly as it was, the dust motes still turning in their silent columns, the pigeons resting on their worn perches, and the morning moving forward at its own imperceptible pace. The keeper bent at the waist and picked up the birch broom from its resting place against the back wall, feeling the familiar balance of the smooth wooden handle settle into his right hand, as if it had been waiting there all night long. The broom was an old tool, its handle worn to a darker shade at the grip, the birch twigs at the base splayed outward in a wide fan that had thinned a little over the seasons, but still held enough spring to gather debris without scattering it. He lifted it and carried it in one hand, while with the other he picked up the galvanized pail, the metal cool and light despite its solidness, and carried both down the center aisle toward the far gable where the sweeping would begin. The floorboards gave their low, familiar notes under his boots, a short sequence of sounds that repeated in a gentle rhythm heel and toe, until he reached the end wall and set the pail down on the planks with a soft, hollow thud that the pigeons ignored entirely. He filled the pail not from the main drinking fountains but from a small tap outside the back wall, a brass spigot fed by the rain barrel, and he opened it just enough to let out a steady, thin stream of water that splashed into the pail with a clean, ringing sound that grew deeper as the water level rose. When the pail was a third full, he closed the tap, carried it back inside, and placed it on the floor at the very center of the loft's far end, positioning it so that he could dip the broom without twisting his body. The water in the pail was clear and still, reflecting a square of pale light from one of the high slats, and he dipped the bristles of the broom into it once, twice, pressing them down gently until the dry birch soaked up enough moisture to darken without dripping. The reason for wetting the broom was simple and old. Dry straw dust, however light, would lift into the air and coat the perches and the birds' lungs if swept without damping, and a dampened broom laid the dust down as it moved, keeping the air clear and the cleaning thorough. So he wet the bristles until they were a deep, cool brown instead of their dry, pale gold, then lifted the broom out and let the excess water run off for a slow count of 3 before moving to the very corner where the back wall met the side wall. The far gable was where the oldest nesting boxes stood, boxes that had been there since the loft was built and were now reserved for the senior racing hens, birds that had flown seasons of races and deserved the quietest corners. The floor in front of these boxes held the night's accumulation of droppings, and it was here that the keeper began. He lowered the broom, the damp bristles touching the pine boards with a soft, sibilant sound that was more a hush than a scrape, and he drew it toward him in a single long stroke that gathered a small ridge of white droppings, bits of chaff, and one pale downy feather into a neat line. The motion was slow and steady, not hurried, the broom moving across the floor like a slow wave retreating from a beach, leaving a clean, dark swath of dampened wood behind. He paused at the end of the stroke and lifted the broom, then stepped slightly to the side and made a second stroke parallel to the first, overlapping the edge just enough that no trace of the previous line remained. The droppings were dry and light, and they clung to the damp bristles without lifting, so that by the end of the second stroke, the broom had gathered a small clump of debris at its leading edge. The keeper continued in this way, stroke after stroke, moving from the corner outward into the aisle. Each stroke began with the broom head placed close against the wall, the bristles bending slightly to reach into the angle where the floorboards met the baseboard. And then he drew it back in a smooth, even motion that ended a hand's breadth into the central aisle, where he would later collect everything into a single pile. The rhythm of the work settled into his body without any conscious decision. 3 strokes and then a brief pause to knock the accumulated debris from the bristles into the growing pile. Then 3 more strokes and another pause. The pauses were not rests, but moments of transition, in which he would lift the broom, tap its head lightly against the floorboard to loosen any clinging matter, and then reposition his feet for the next section. His breathing matched the rhythm, slow and steady, and his eyes stayed on the floor just ahead of the broom, watching the surface change from speckled to clean with each pass. The sound of the sweeping was a quiet, continuous whisper that filled the loft without disturbing its stillness. It was a sound made of several small elements woven together, the slide of wet birch twigs over smooth pine, the faint tick of hard bits of chaff being pushed along, and underneath both, the very distant creak of the broom handle flexing in his grip. The pigeons listened to this sound every morning, and they accepted it as they accepted the light through the slats as a part of the loft's natural order. A few birds opened their eyes when the sweeping drew near their perches, watching the movement of the broom with the detached curiosity of creatures who had never been threatened by a bundle of twigs. One young bird, a blue checker not yet a year old, leaned far over its perch to inspect the floor, cocking its head to one side so that one orange eye could look straight down at the moving bristles, and then, satisfied, it pulled back and preened a covert feather with the tip of its beak. As he worked his way along the back wall, and then turned to work along the west side, the morning light continued its slow shift, the sun climbing higher behind the ventilation slats, so that the beams that fell into the loft moved across the floor like the hands of a clock made of light. One beam that had been falling on the far left corner when he began now touched the edge of the center aisle, illuminating a patch of floorboards and showing up every grain line, every tiny knot in the wood, every scratch made by the hobnails of his boots over the years. Tiny motes of dust still floated in the beam, though fewer now than when he had opened the door, and they turned and spun in the light as if performing some slow ceremony of their own. When his sweeping passed through the beam, the damp broom darkened it for a moment, and then the light returned, slightly altered, the wet wood gleaming with a soft muted sheen that would fade in a few minutes as the water evaporated into the loft air. The debris that the broom collected varied as he moved from section to section. Near the nesting boxes there was more chaff, those thin, papery husks that fell away from the straw when the birds worked it with their beaks, and mixed with the chaff were tiny fragments of eggshell from a recent hatching that had been crushed into the nest bowl and then kicked out. Further along, under the perches where the younger birds roosted, the droppings were smaller and more numerous, arranged in little constellations around the exact spots where the birds had sat through the night. There were feathers, too, the small body feathers that the pigeons shed in the normal course of living, soft grey ovals no larger than a thumbnail that would lift easily if the broom were dry, but now lay flat and still against the dampened bristles. He found a single primary feather from a wing, longer than his hand, its vein still perfect, and its shaft a translucent white that caught the light. He picked this up and set it aside on a clean windowsill, because a good flight feather was worth keeping for mending other birds' broken quills. When he had cleared the floor along the entire west side, from the back wall to halfway down the length of the loft, he paused, straightened his back, and looked back at the path he had made. The swept section of the floor was darker than the unswept section, damp and clean and free of any visible debris, and it stretched behind him like a long, quiet statement of completed work. The unswept section ahead was lightly scattered with the same sorts of droppings and chaff, and he looked at it without hurry, assessing how many more strokes would be needed to reach the door. He dipped the broom in the pail again, the water now slightly cloudy with the dust it had absorbed, and resumed the rhythm, working his way further down the west side. At about the midpoint of the loft, a pigeon fluttered down from the third row of perches to the floor. It was a mature blue barcock, one of the more confident birds in the loft, and it landed on the boards a few feet ahead of the broom with a soft, hollow-sounding thump, and a brief, rapid beat of wings that settled immediately. The bird stood there, its scaled pink feet gripping the floorboards, and it watched the approaching broom with a round, unblinking eye that held all the calm of an afternoon sky. The keeper did not stop his sweeping nor change his pace, because he knew the bird would move when the broom came near, and it did, stepping sideways with a neat, unhurried shuffle that placed it just clear of the bristles, and then, a moment later, launching itself back up to its perch with a single downstroke of its wings that left a small puff of displaced air. The whole interaction lasted no more than 10 seconds, and then the sweeping continued exactly as before, the broom passing over the spot where the bird had stood as if nothing had happened. As the morning wore on, the keeper worked his way past the center of the loft and began on the east side, moving now in the opposite direction so that he could sweep toward the door. The sun had shifted the light beams again, and now one beam fell directly on the drinking fountains, lighting up the glazed clay surfaces so that they shone with a warm, rich terracotta glow. The air in the loft was gradually warming, the cool dampness of dawn giving way to a drier, more open warmth that carried the scent of the cedar perches more strongly. The pigeons were now fully awake, though still mostly still, and their soft cooing had risen to a steady, low murmur that filled the space like a blanket of sound, so constant that after a while it became almost indistinguishable from silence. At last the broom reached the area just inside the door, the final section of floor that had been hidden by the door's swing when he entered. This area always collected the most debris, because it was where the birds passed when they went out to the landing board, and the keeper spent extra time here, making smaller strokes, overlapping each pass by a wider margin, until the floorboards were as clean as those at the far gable. He swept all the accumulated debris, the droppings, chaff, scattered seeds that had been kicked from the feeding trough, and the single grey feather that had been by the threshold into one small, neat pile just beside the door, tamping it down with a few light pats of the broom so that it would not scatter. The pile was roughly the size of a dinner plate and about as high as 2 fingers, a miniature mountain of the loft's overnight life, composed of 100 small, dry, clean things that before the sweeping had been scattered over the whole floor. He stood the broom against the wall and looked at the pile, and then out through the open door at the meadow, where the fog had burned away entirely and the grass was now a bright, fresh green under a sky that had turned from grey to a soft, washed-out blue. A breeze had begun to move, just enough to stir the tops of the grass, and he felt it on his face as a faint, cool breath. The loft behind him was quiet and clean, the floor stretching away in a long, dark, even expanse, every board damp-swept and free of litter, and the pigeons sat on their perches above it, as if nothing had occurred. Their world restored to its morning order. The first sweeping was done, and the pile waited to be carried out to the compost heap behind the loft. But not yet. For a moment, he simply stood in the doorway, feeling the sun on his shoulders and the cool air on his face, and he let the quiet settle into him like water into dry ground. The sweepings had been carried out to the compost heap behind the loft, ticked from the flat pan of a wooden scoop into a low, layered mound of old straw and droppings that steamed faintly in the warming sun, and the keeper had returned the scoop to its hook beside the door. The floorboards were dry now, their damp sheen long evaporated, and the whole interior smelled of clean wet wood, giving way slowly to the older, steadier scents of cedar and straw. He stood in the centre aisle with his hands resting on his hips, looking up at the rows of perches, and he saw what he saw every morning after the floor was swept: the accumulation of droppings on the wood, a fine white crust that had dried into the grain overnight, and here and there a darker smudge where a bird had shuffled its feet. The perches needed scrubbing, and after the perches the nest boxes would need their bowls changed and their corners wiped clean, a sequence as fixed as the sweep and the grain measure. He went to the back corner where a shelf held the cleaning things, a square of heavy cotton cloth that had once been part of a flour sack, its fibers softened by many washings and its edges frayed into a thin fringe, and beside it a shallow tin basin containing a bar of plain brown soap that smelled faintly of lye and tallow. He took both and set the basin on the floor under the tap outside, filling it with water from the rain barrel until the soap was just covered. The water was cool and soft, rainwater that had been filtered through the loft's own gutters, and it took the soap easily, releasing a thin milky bloom as he rubbed the bar between his palms. He wet the cloth, wrung it out so that it was damp but not dripping, and worked the soap into one corner of it until a modest lather appeared. The cloth now carried the clean, sharp scent of the soap, a smell that promised order. He began with the top row of perches on the east side, the highest tier where the older racing cocks sat. To reach them he had to stretch his arms just slightly, the cloth held between his fingers with a light, practiced grip. The first perch he chose was occupied by a dark checker cock, a bird that had flown the previous season's long race from the south, and now spent its days in contented retirement. The keeper approached slowly, making a low sound in his throat that was not quite a word, more a gentle vibration of acknowledgement. The bird watched him, its ruby eye bright but calm, and it did not move as he brought the damp cloth close. He began at the outermost end of the perch, where a small white cap of dried droppings had built up, and he wiped with a motion that was half a rub and half a press, letting the warm soapy water soften the deposit. The droppings lifted away in thin, chalky layers, revealing the polished cedar beneath, a rich honey color with a grain like fine brushstrokes. He wiped the full length of the perch in slow, overlapping passes, turning the cloth as he went so that a clean face always touched the wood, and when he reached the end nearest the bird's feet he paused, letting the bird decide whether to step aside. The checker cock lifted one foot, inspected the cloth with a brief downward glance, and then obligingly stepped over it, settling again a few inches further along with the air of a monarch granting passage. The keeper finished the perch and drew the cloth back, leaving behind a smooth, clean surface that shone with a faint damp luster. He moved to the next perch along the top row, and then the next, working his way from the back wall toward the door. Each perch was cleaned in the same quiet sequence: the approach, the low murmur, the initial softening of the white crust, the steady wipe that revealed cedar, the color of dark honey, the final pass to remove any streak of soap. The birds that sat on the perches he was cleaning mostly remained in place, shifting only when the cloth came within a few inches of their feet, and he worked around them as a gardener works around established plants, with a respect for their settledness. One perch near the center held a young blue bar that had not yet learned the morning routine, and this bird fluttered up at the first touch of the cloth, circled the loft once with a soft whir of wings, and then returned to the same spot, landing with a small wobble and immediately settling its feathers with a shake. The keeper waited until it was still, then wiped the dried droppings from the wood where it had perched, the cloth sliding under its feet in a motion so practiced that the bird did not stir again. The cloth gradually picked up the white chalk of the droppings and the faint grey dust of the loft, and when it became too soiled to leave the wood clean, the keeper stepped down from the stool, rinsed the cloth in the basin of soapy water until the water ran cloudy, wrung it out, and soaked it afresh. The water in the basin turned from clear to a pale milky grey, and the bar of soap shrank by a sliver that would not be noticeable until the end of summer. He worked his way along the entire top row, then moved to the second row, which was slightly easier to reach, the level where his eyes were when he stood straight. The second row held the hens that were not presently on eggs, and they were quieter birds on the whole, some of them sleeping even now, their heads drawn in and their feathers fluffed against the cool morning. When the cloth touched their perches, they opened their eyes, blinked once or twice, and then closed them again, as if the cleaning were a dream from which there was no need to wake. The work had a rhythm that was different from the broad, arm-swinging rhythm of the sweeping. This was a finer, closer rhythm, a matter of small wrist movements and careful finger pressure, of paying attention to the exact texture of the wood and the way the grain ran. The keeper felt the cedar under his cloth in all its variations. Here a knot that was slightly rougher than the surrounding wood, there a shallow groove worn by years of gripping claws, the groove so smooth that it took the soapy water almost reluctantly, needing an extra pass to clean properly. He noticed a splinter in one perch, a tiny lift of wood that had begun to separate from the surface, and he paused to press it down with his thumb, testing whether it would catch a bird's foot. It lay flat and would hold for another season, but he made a mental note to sand it when the birds were out for their exercise. These small discoveries, the splinter, the knot, the worn groove, were the text of his morning, and he read them with the same attention that a scholar might read a familiar page. After the second row, he cleaned the third row, and then the lowest row, which was set just above the nest boxes and required him to stoop slightly, his back bending into a comfortable curve. By the time he had cleaned all 4 rows on the east side, the sun had shifted, so that the beams through the high slats now fell on the west side perches, warming them slightly and making the damp streaks from his cleaning dry faster. He rinsed the cloth a final time, the water in the basin now quite grey, and he carried the basin to the door to tip the water out onto the grass, where it scattered in a brief dark arc and then soaked away into the soil. He refilled the basin with fresh rainwater, re-soaked the cloth, and crossed to the west side to begin again. The west side perches held a different assortment of birds, the young ones from the spring hatch, the birds that were being rested between training tosses, and a few old veterans that preferred the afternoon light that came through the west slats. They were essentially the same as the east side birds in their behavior, watching him with the same round, unblinking eyes, stepping aside with the same neat shuffle when the cloth approached. The work on the west side took no longer and no shorter than the work on the east side. It was simply a mirror of it, a balanced completion of the task. When he wiped the last perch on the lowest row, he straightened up, folded the damp cloth over the edge of the basin, and looked at the rows of perches that now ran the full length of both walls. Every length of cedar was clean and smooth, the color of it deepened by the moisture, and the whole loft seemed to glow with a quiet, scrubbed light. The pigeons had settled back into their places as if nothing had been disturbed, and they sat on their clean perches with the easy contentment of animals for whom the physical world is always exactly as it should be. Now he turned his attention to the nest boxes. These were the small open-fronted cubicles built of pine that lined the walls below the lowest perches, each one about 18 inches wide and a foot deep, with a low lip at the front to keep the nest balls from sliding out. Some boxes were empty at this time of year, their hens having finished raising their squabs and rejoined the general flock, while others held birds that were sitting on a second round of eggs. The hens pressed low and still over the pale ovals like bakers resting beside a warm oven. The keeper started with the empty boxes, the ones he could clean without disturbing a sitting bird. He knelt on the floorboards, the wood hard under his knees through the wool of his trousers, and reached into the first box with both hands. The old nest bowl inside was a shallow dish of pressed clay, its interior lined with bits of dry straw that the hen had arranged into a rough circle before laying. The bowl was dusty and held a few tiny feather sheaths and the dried remains of a broken egg membrane from the last hatching. He lifted it out carefully, cradling it in both palms, and set it on the floor beside him. Then he took a small stiff brush from his pocket, a brush with short bristles that had been cut down from an old paintbrush, and he used it to sweep out the corners of the empty nest box, dislodging the fine debris that had collected there. A single dried pea, overlooked from some past feeding, rolled out, and he picked it up and put it in his pocket to return to the grain bin later. The clay bowl itself needed scrubbing, and he took it out into the sunlight behind the loft where he had set a second pail of water. Kneeling beside the pail, he dipped the bowl in the water and used the stiff brush to work away the lingering dirt, the bristles making a soft, rhythmic scratch over the baked clay. The water turned muddy, and when he lifted the bowl out, the terracotta color of the clay was restored to a warm, earthy red that had been hidden under the dust. He shook the water from it, set it on the grass to drain for a moment, and then dried it with a clean corner of his cloth before carrying it back inside. A fresh pressed straw bowl waited on the stack of supplies at the back of the loft, its shape identical to the clay one but lighter and paler, woven from oat straw that had been pressed in a mold until it held its own curve. He fitted this new bowl into the cleaned nest box, pressing it down gently so that it sat snug against the back wall, and then moved to the next empty box. One by one, the empty nest boxes were emptied, brushed out, their old clay bowls washed and set aside to be stored for future use, and fresh straw bowls fitted in their places. The work was quiet and repetitive, the same motions repeated with small variations depending on the depth of the box or the amount of debris. In one box he found a small cache of grain that a bird had hoarded, a dozen kernels of maize tucked into the corner as if hidden from the others, and he left them where they were because a bird's private store was its own business. In another box he discovered a single blue-green lousefly, flat and quick, and he caught it between his thumb and forefinger and crushed it, then wiped his fingers on the cloth. These were the small incidents that punctuated the task without breaking its essential calm. At last he came to the boxes where hens were sitting. There were 3 of them, 3 hens that had laid in the early summer and now spent their days and nights pressed over their eggs with a patience that seemed almost geological. The first sitting hen was in a box near the east wall, a small mealy hen with feathers the color of wheat flour, and she watched the keeper through a slit of an eye as he knelt before her box. He did not lift her. Instead, he reached around her carefully, his fingers moving with a slowness that was almost ceremonial, and he brushed out the loose straw that had accumulated at the edges of her bowl. The clay bowl itself would not be changed until the eggs had hatched and the squabs had fledged, but he could wipe its rim and ensure that no droppings had fallen into the box from the perch above. He used a corner of the damp cloth to wipe the front lip of the box, and the mealy hen watched this without alarm, her small grey head turning only slightly to follow the motion, her body remaining a warm, constant weight over the 2 white eggs beneath her. The second sitting hen was a blue bar with a notably placid temperament, and she did not even open her eyes as he tidied the edges of her nest. The third was a young hen, a first-time sitter, and she was slightly more anxious, shuffling her wings and making a low, throaty sound that was not quite a growl when his hand came near. He paused, withdrew his hand a little, and waited, speaking to her in the same low murmur he used for all the birds, a sound that was more breath than voice. After a moment the young hen settled, her feathers smoothing down, and he was able to brush around her bowl with 2 quick, gentle passes. Then he left her in peace and stood up, his knees stiff from the floorboards and a pleasant ache running through his lower back from the bending and stretching. The nest boxes were now all clean and orderly, their fresh straw bowls glowing with a pale golden light that seemed to radiate a quiet promise of future hatchings. The keeper carried the basin of now dirty water back outside, emptied it onto the grass, and rinsed the basin and his hands under the tap. The water from the rain barrel was still cool, and he cupped some in his palms and splashed it on his face, letting it run down the back of his neck and into the collar of his shirt. He stood for a moment in the full sun, which was now well above the alders and beginning to carry real warmth, and he looked back into the dim interior of the loft through the open door. Inside, the perches stretched in clean, straight lines, the nest boxes below them a neat row of pale straw circles, and the pigeons sat among it all, like the quiet citizens of a small, well-kept town. The air that drifted out through the door was fresh and clean, soap-scented and cedar-scented, and it mixed with the smell of the meadow grass until the two were indistinguishable. He wrung out the cloth one last time, folded it, and set it on the shelf beside the soap. The basin he turned upside down so that it would not collect dust. Then he stood in the aisle, breathing the clean air, and let the morning continue around him without hurry. The scrubbing was done, the bowls were changed, and the loft was ready for the next slow task of the day. But he did not move toward it yet. He stood and listened to the pigeons cooing, their voices now a steady, untroubled hum that rose and fell like the breath of the building itself. And he felt the simple satisfaction of a space put in order, a satisfaction that had no urgency and no end. The loft's center was marked by a long wooden bench that had stood in the same place since the building was raised, its legs sunk into the earth beneath the floorboards so that it would never shift or wobble. The bench was made of 2 wide planks of elm, their edges joined so tightly that a knife blade could not find a gap, and the surface had been planed smooth years ago, and then polished by the constant slide of clay vessels and the brush of the keeper's sleeves. A low rim ran around 3 sides, a simple lip of wood that kept things from rolling off, and beneath the bench was a shallow shelf where spare fountains were stored upside down. The bench divided the loft into 2 halves, not by a wall, but by purpose. Everything forward of it was the birds' living space, the perches and nest boxes, while the area behind it was the keeper's working ground, where the buckets and sacks and scoops waited in neat order. When the keeper had finished with the nest boxes, he washed his hands for the second time that morning at the outside tap, and then came to stand before this bench, looking at the row of drinking fountains and feeding troughs that waited to be filled. There were 6 drinking fountains, each one a glazed clay vessel, shaped like a small squat vase with a narrow neck and a flared base that kept it steady on the bench. Their glaze was a deep, earthy brown on the outside and a paler cream inside, and over the years the rims had developed fine crackling tiny lines that spread through the glaze like frost on a window. The fountains worked by a simple principle. The narrow neck held the water in place by vacuum, releasing it only as the birds drank from the shallow lip, so that the water stayed clean and did not evaporate quickly. The keeper lifted the first fountain, cradling its cool weight in both hands, and he could feel the slosh of the water that remained from the previous day. It was stale now, faintly warmed by the loft air, and a thin film of dust had settled on its surface, along with a single small feather that floated like a grey boat. He carried the fountain out through the door, walking carefully so that he did not slop water onto his boots, and he tipped the old water out onto the grass at the corner of the loft, where the ground was already damp from the earlier bucket emptyings. The water made a brief dark splash and then sank away, leaving the feather stuck to a blade of grass. He returned to the bench and collected the second fountain, and then the third, carrying them out one by one, because that was how he had always done it, not out of any need to stretch a task, but because the repetitions themselves were the shape of the morning. The stale water from all 6 fountains went into the grass, and the grass bent under it and sprang back, and the ground drank it up without a trace. When the last fountain was emptied, he set all 6 on the grass in a line, their open necks pointing upward, and he went back inside to fetch the rinsing pail. This was a smaller pail, a wooden bucket with a rope handle, and he filled it halfway with fresh rainwater from the tap, the water running clear and cold from the barrel that had been filled by the rains of early summer. He carried the pail to where the fountain sat on the grass, knelt down, and took up the first one. Rinsing a drinking fountain was a task that required a certain gentle precision. He tipped the vessel onto its side, let a little water run into the neck, and swirled it around with a circular motion of his wrist, the water sloshing against the glazed interior walls and carrying away the thin film of dust and the faint residue of overnight. He shook the water out in a single sharp motion, a flick of the arm that sent droplets flying in a brief arc, and then he held the fountain up to the light to look inside. The glaze was clean and slightly glossy, and there was no trace of the bloom that meant algae was beginning to form. Satisfied, he set the rinsed fountain on the grass to drain and took up the next. Each one received the same treatment, the same swirl and shake and inspection, until all 6 stood clean and empty on the grass, their interiors gleaming damply in the sun. Now he carried them back inside, 2 at a time, cupping their bases in his palms, and set them in a row on the bench. Then he went back out with the larger pail, the galvanized one he used for the floor water, and he filled it nearly to the brim from the tap. The pail was heavy when full, the water a clear, shifting weight that pulled against his arm, and he carried it inside with both hands, walking slowly so that no water spilled over the rim. He placed the pail on the bench, and then, one by one, he filled each drinking fountain. He poured the water from the pail in a steady, thin stream that made a soft, musical sound as it struck the clay interior, a sound that was low at first and then rose in pitch as the vessel filled. When the water reached the bottom of the narrow neck, he stopped pouring exactly at the right moment so that no drop overflowed, and he set the fountain upright on the bench. The water inside was perfectly clear, still as glass, and through the pale cream glaze of the interior it took on a faint golden tint from the light that fell through the slats. When all 6 fountains were full, he distributed them along the bench, spacing them evenly so that all the birds could drink without crowding. He pressed each one down firmly so that its flared base sat flat and would not tip if a bird landed on its rim. The water in the fountains was so still that it reflected the ceiling beams above in miniature, thin, dark lines running across circles of light, and a single dust mote that had settled on the surface of the nearest fountain drifted slowly toward the rim, as if curious about what lay beyond. With the water seen to, he turned his attention to the feeding troughs. These were long, shallow trays made of the same elm wood as the bench, each one about 2 feet long and 6 inches wide, with low sides that allowed the birds to feed without climbing in. They had been wiped clean the evening before, and they now sat empty and dry, their bottoms pale and smooth. The keeper gave each trough a quick pass with a dry corner of the cloth, not because they needed it, but because the habit of checking was ingrained. And then he placed them in a neat row on the floor in front of the bench, where the birds liked to feed. He laid them end to end, forming a continuous line of wood that stretched almost from one side of the loft to the other. And then he stepped back and looked at them with a brief, assessing glance, as if measuring their capacity by eye. The grain sacks stood against the back wall, 4 of them, each made of coarse brown burlap and printed with the name of a mill in a town 2 days' cart ride away. The letters had been stamped on with black ink that had softened over time into a grey blur, but the keeper did not need to read the names to know the grain inside. He knew by the shape of the sacks, by the way they slumped against one another, by the faint, sweet scent that came through the burlap when he stood near. The largest sack held yellow maize, kernels of a bright, hard gold that had been dried on the cob and then stripped and bagged. The next held grey peas, a variety grown specifically for pigeon feed, small and round and dense, their colour the soft grey of a winter sky. The third sack held wheat, the plump golden brown grains that were the birds' preferred morning feed. And the fourth was a mixture of small seeds, canary seed, and millet, and a little hemp, that was given only on race days as a special meal. All 4 sacks were tied at the neck with lengths of sisal twine, the knots stiff and easy to loosen. The keeper untied the sack of maize first, working the knot with his fingers until the twine fell away, and he folded back the top of the sack to reveal the bright yellow grain within. The smell of the maize rose up, a dry, sweet, dusty smell that spoke of long, hot afternoons in a field far from this meadow, and he scooped a measure of it with the big tin scoop that hung from a nail on the bench leg. The scoop was a simple tool, a deep, rounded bowl of tin with a wooden handle worn dark by grip, and it held exactly 1 portion of grain, a measure that had been worked out over years of watching how much the birds ate and how much they left behind. He tipped the scoop over the first feeding trough and let the maize pour out in a thick, even stream, the kernels clattering against the wood with a sound like rain on a loose roof tile. He spread the grain along the length of the trough with a sweep of his fingers so that the yellow kernels lay in a shallow, even layer, and then he returned to the sack for a second scoop and a third until all the troughs had a bedding of maize. Next came the grey peas. He opened that sack and scooped out a measure, and the peas were heavier than the maize, denser, and they fell into the troughs with a deeper, softer sound. A sound like pebbles dropped into thick mud. He scattered them over the maize in a sparing quantity, not too many because the peas were rich and the birds would eat them first and fill their crops too quickly if he was not careful. After the peas came the wheat, which was the lightest of the three grains in both weight and colour, its kernels small and plump and a pale, warm tan. The wheat poured from the scoop in a delicate stream that mixed with the maize and peas, settling into the gaps between the larger grains, and the keeper used his fingers to stir each trough gently, blending the three grains together so that the birds would not have to pick through one layer to reach another. The mixture in the troughs was now a mosaic of gold and grey and tan, a dry, clean, savoury palette of colours that caught the light and held it, each grain a tiny, perfect thing waiting to be eaten. He retied the sacks, pulling the twine tight and knotting it with a quick, sure movement, and then he hung the scoop back on its nail and dusted his hands together over the bench. A fine powder from the grain, a blend of maize starch and wheat dust, had settled on his palms and fingers, and he rubbed them together to let the dust fall onto the floorboards where it would be swept up in the evening. The loft was now fully provisioned for the morning feed, water glinting in 6 clay fountains, grain layered in the long wooden troughs, and all around, the pigeons watching. The birds had been patient throughout this work, but now their attention sharpened. They had seen the keeper move the sacks, they had heard the grain pour into the troughs, and the sound was a signal that their bodies understood even before their minds. The first bird to come down was the old dark-checkered cock from the top row of the east perches, a bird that knew the routine as well as the keeper himself. It launched from its perch with a soft, rapid clap of wings and glided down to the floor beside the nearest trough, landing with a neat, 2-footed hop and immediately dipping its beak into the grain. A moment later, it was joined by others, a steady trickle of birds fluttering down from the perches on both sides, their wings making a dry, papery rustle and the air filling with the soft thumps of their landings. Within the span of a minute, the floor around the feeding troughs was crowded with pigeons, their bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder in a long, grey, shifting line. The sound of their eating began at once, a soft, busy chatter of beaks against wood and grain, a sound that was made up of dozens of tiny clicks and taps woven together into a continuous whole. It was not a harsh sound, not a greedy sound, but a sound of industry, of small creatures performing the ancient work of feeding. The birds pecked at the grain with quick, precise jabs of their heads, each jab picking up a single kernel of maize or a single pea, which was then swallowed with a visible bob of the throat. Their beaks made a delicate ticking noise against the bare wood when they missed a grain or probed for one that had rolled into a corner, and their claws made a soft scratching sound as they shifted position to reach a better spot. Now and again, a bird would raise its head, its crop already beginning to swell with the grain it had eaten, and it would look around with a bright, alert eye before lowering its head again and continuing to feed. The keeper stood behind the bench, watching them with the calm, unhurried attention of a man who had seen this same scene unfold on hundreds of mornings. He noticed the small dynamics that played out along the feeding line, a younger bird that edged a little too close to an older one and was rebuffed with a single irritable peck that did no harm but sent a clear message, a pair of mates that fed side by side, their wings almost touching, moving in a synchronized rhythm, a widowed hen that always fed apart, waiting until the others had taken their fill before slipping in quietly to pick at the remaining grains. These were the ordinary patterns of the loft, as fixed and quiet as the grain itself, and the keeper noted them without needing to think about them, just as he noted that the light had shifted again and was now striking the bench at a lower angle, warming the wood to a deeper brown. When most of the birds had eaten their fill and begun to drift away from the troughs, their crops rounded and their movements slower and more contented, the keeper noticed that the water fountains were now being visited. A bird would walk from the feeding area to the bench, hop up onto the rim of a fountain and lower its beak to the water. The pigeons drank differently from other birds. They did not take a sip and then tilt their heads back, but instead they inserted their beaks into the water and drank in a long, continuous draw, the water moving up into their throats in a single, unhurried draught. One blue bar cock stood at the fountain for a full 30 seconds, its beak in the water and its throat pulsing gently, the level of the water inside the fountain dropping by a tiny but visible amount. When it had finished drinking, it lifted its head, its beak still wet and gleaming, and it stood for a moment with its eyes half closed in what looked like deep satisfaction. Then it flapped up to its perch and settled into a patch of sunlight that had found its way to the third row, tucking its head around to preen the feathers of its back. The keeper took the scoop again, not for the main feed but for the grit. Grit was essential. Small sharp grains of grey sand and crushed oyster shell that the birds swallowed and held in their gizzards, where the grains worked against each other to grind up the hard maize and peas into a digestible paste. The grit bin was a clay pot near the bench, and he scooped a handful of the grey sand from it and scattered it along a separate small tray that he kept just for this purpose. The grit fell with a fine sandy hiss, and within moments several birds had discovered it and were pecking at it with the same steady determination they had shown toward the grain. When the feeding had wound down, and the last few birds were picking at the remaining scattered grains on the floor, the keeper took a final walk along the line of troughs. He noted how much grain had been eaten and how much remained, because the amount they left told him whether the measure was right. Today they had eaten nearly all of it, leaving only a few stray peas and a light dust of maize flour along the bottoms of the troughs. A good feed, he thought, and he made a small mental note in the part of his mind that kept track of such things, a note that would be transferred to the ledger later. He collected the troughs, tipped the last few grains back into the sacks because nothing was wasted, and wiped the wood clean with a dry cloth. Then he went outside to the tap and rinsed his hands, the cool water washing away the last of the grain dust, and he stood for a moment in the sun, which was now high enough to cast almost no shadow. Inside the loft, the pigeons were settling into their post-meal stillness, their crops full and their bodies warm, and the soft, murmuring coos had taken on a deeper, more contented tone. The water and grain were done, and the loft was quiet again, resting in the middle of the long summer morning. The perches were clean, the nest boxes had fresh straw bowls, and the floor still carried the faint damp trace of its morning sweeping. The keeper rinsed his hands one final time at the outside tap, letting the cool rainwater run over his knuckles and drip from his fingertips, then dried them on a clean square of linen he kept folded on the shelf beside the door. The morning had moved past its middle and was now settling into the steady, unhurried warmth of the later hours, the sun high enough to shorten the shadows outside and to turn the ventilation slats into bright strips of gold. He walked to the long wooden bench that stood against the center of the west wall, a bench made of 2 thick planks supported by sturdy legs, its surface worn smooth and slightly hollowed where generations of feed scoops had rested. On the bench sat the drinking fountains and the feeding troughs, all of them waiting in the quiet, patient way that objects wait when they are used every day. The drinking fountains were glazed clay vessels, shaped like tall, narrow bowls, with an inverted reservoir that held the water and released it slowly into a shallow surrounding dish as the birds drank. There were 4 of them, spaced evenly along the bench, their terracotta bodies decorated with a simple band of white slip near the rim that had been applied by a potter somewhere in the next town. Each fountain still held a small amount of water from the previous day, water that was now faintly cloudy with the dust and the small bits of seed husk that the birds had washed from their beaks. He lifted the first fountain in both hands, feeling the weight of the remaining water shift inside, and carried it to the door, stepping outside into the full sunshine to tip the old water onto the grass. The water splashed out in a brief dark spread that the dry ground drank in immediately, leaving only a small patch of darker green. He shook the last drops from the fountain, turned it upside down to check that no grit had lodged in the narrow mouth of the reservoir, and then carried it back inside. The tap behind the loft gave water that was cool and bright, drawn from the rain barrel that collected the runoff from the tiled roof and filtered it through a mesh of fine cloth tied over the top. He held each fountain under the tap in turn, letting the water run until the vessel was full and the clay darkened along its lower portion where the moisture soaked in. He wiped the outside of each fountain with his cloth, removing any dust that had settled since the morning, and set them back on the bench in their usual places. The water inside them was perfectly still and clear, catching the light from the high slats so that each fountain held a small trembling reflection of the loft's rafters. The smell of the clean clay and fresh water joined the other scents in the air, a cool, mineral note that seemed to sharpen the sweetness of the straw. Next he turned to the feeding troughs, which were long, shallow trays carved from a single piece of light pine, their edges rounded and their interiors darkened by the oil of countless seeds. The troughs ran the length of the bench, divided into sections by low cross pieces, so that the birds could feed without crowding. The previous day's grain was mostly gone, only a few stray husks and a single split pea remaining in the far corner. He picked up the pea and put it in his pocket, then lifted each trough from the bench and carried it outside to brush it clean with a dry cloth. The pine was warm from the sun, and it released a faint, resinous scent as he worked. Once the troughs were free of debris, he set them back on the bench, aligning them carefully so that they sat exactly flush with the front edge of the plank. The grain was stored in 3 burlap sacks that sat on a low wooden pallet in the back corner of the loft, raised off the floor to keep them dry and safe from the small mice that sometimes found their way in during the winter. The sacks were old but sound, their coarse weave patched here and there with twine stitches where the jute had worn thin, and each one was tied at the neck with a length of sisal rope. The keeper untied the first sack, which held the yellow maize, and the smell of the grain rose up to meet him. A clean, dusty, slightly sweet scent that held the memory of the hot August fields where it had been harvested. He took the tin scoop from its hook on the wall, a scoop that held exactly 1 ration when filled level, and he dipped it into the maize, drawing out a mound of bright yellow kernels that glowed like small pieces of polished amber. The maize rattled against the sides of the scoop with a dry, pleasant sound as he carried it to the troughs and poured it in an even layer along the center section. The second sack held the grey peas, plump and round, each one about the size of a fingernail, their skins a soft, dusty greenish grey with a faint bloom like the surface of a grape. He measured out half a scoop of peas and scattered them over the maize, the 2 colours mixing in a pattern that was pleasing to look at, the bright yellow and the muted grey. The third sack held the wheat, a smaller grain with a pale biscuity colour and a smooth, polished surface that slid easily against itself. A 1/4 scoop of wheat went into the trough, and then he added a small handful of safflower seeds from a clay jar on the shelf, the tiny white seeds forming like grains of rice among the larger kernels. This was the morning mix, the balanced ration that gave the birds the strength and condition they needed for flying, and he had measured it so many times that his hands knew the proportions without any conscious calculation. He took a final moment to stir the grain with his fingers, mixing it lightly so that no bird would get only maize while another got only peas, and then he stepped back from the bench. The pigeons had noticed the preparation, as they always did. A few had flown down from the upper perches and were now standing on the floorboards, walking with that peculiar, dignified strut that pigeons have, their heads bobbing forward and back with each step. More birds were watching from above, leaning over the edges of their perches, and the cooing in the loft had risen in volume and speed, a chorus of anticipation that filled the space with a low, thrumming energy. The keeper smiled without moving his mouth, a small private expression that lived only in his eyes, and he stepped away from the bench to let the birds come. They came in a soft rush, not all at once but in waves, the boldest first and the shyer ones following. Wings opened and closed with a dry, papery sound, and the floorboards thumped gently as birds landed. The pigeons gathered around the troughs, jostling lightly, not fighting, but arranging themselves with the subtle, wordless negotiation of creatures that have lived together all their lives. Their heads dipped and rose, the small sharp beaks picking up a grain of maize here and a pea there, the food swallowed with a quick, delicate motion of the throat. The sound of feeding was a soft, continuous tapping, like the first few drops of rain on a broad leaf, mixed with the occasional low coo of satisfaction. The keeper stood to one side, watching them feed, and he noted that the dark checker in the corner was eating well, despite his advancing age, and that one of the young blues had pushed its way to the front with an assertiveness that might serve it well in the racing season. The drinking fountains were also busy. A few birds stood on the rims of the shallow dishes, bending down to dip their beaks into the clear water and then tilting their heads back to let the water slide down their throats. The motion was always the same. A quick sip, the beak opening and closing, and then the head lifting so that the water could run down the long, slender neck with a tiny, visible ripple under the feathers. The keeper watched this with a quiet appreciation, the simple act of a bird drinking being one of those small, perfect things that never lost its interest. The fountains were not crowded, birds coming and going in a steady, orderly cycle, and by the time the first wave had drunk their fill and returned to the perches, a second wave was already descending. He waited until the feeding had settled into a quieter hum, the first hunger satisfied and the birds now picking at the remaining grains with a more leisurely pace. Then he took the water bucket and topped up each fountain from the rain barrel tap, adding just enough to replace what had been drunk, the fresh water swirling gently into the older water until the surface was perfectly level and still again. The fountains would need no more attention until the evening, when he would empty and refill them once more before closing up for the night. The feeding and watering had taken perhaps half an hour from start to finish, a peaceful interlude between the larger tasks of the morning, and now the loft was in a state of calm contentment. The pigeons were on their perches, many of them with full crops that made a soft, rounded bulge at the base of the throat, and they were preening themselves with slow, thorough strokes of their beaks. The preening was a sound in itself, a faint dry rustle of feathers being drawn through the bill, and occasionally a small puff of down would float free and drift lazily through a sunbeam before settling on the clean floorboards. The keeper bent to pick up a stray feather that had fallen during the feeding, a small, soft breast feather of the palest grey, and he set it on the windowsill with the primary feather he had saved earlier. He looked out through the open door at the meadow. The sun was high now, the heat beginning to build, and the grass was a brilliant green under the blue-white sky. A few swallows were wheeling high up, their sharp, curved wings catching the light as they turned, and their distant, twittering calls fell through the air like small, scattered notes. Inside the loft, the temperature had risen just enough to make the air feel thick and drowsy, and the scent of the clean water and the fresh grain had blended with the older, softer smells of cedar and straw into a single atmosphere of well-kept quiet. The morning was moving toward noon, but before the noon rest there was one more task, one that required the ledger and the ring box, and he would come to it soon. For now, he stood in the doorway, feeling the sun on his face and the cool loft air at his back, and he let the minutes pass without counting them. The morning had moved through its sequence of tasks like a slow, quiet wheel turning in place, and now the sun stood directly overhead, its light falling through the high slats in short, steep angles that pulled on the floorboards and then began to retreat. The keeper straightened his back and stood for a moment in the center aisle, letting the stillness of the loft settle round him. A stillness that was not empty, but full of the soft breathing and occasional feather rustle of contented birds. The drinking fountains had been topped, the grain troughs were clean, and the feeding had come to its natural end. The pigeons now perched in drowsy rows with their crops full and their eyes half closed. He walked to the shelf by the door, took the folded linen cloth that held his midday meal and tucked it under his arm, then stepped out through the open doorway into the full, warm light of noon. The meadow lay before him in a deep, green silence, the grass now dry and smelling of sweet hay after the morning's evaporation, the scattered wild flowers of early summer white yarrow, yellow bead straw holding their heads, perfectly still in the motionless air. The sun had warmed the south-facing wall of the loft, and the old silver-grey planks radiated a gentle, stalled heat that he could feel from several paces away. Against this wall, just to the right of the door, sat the upturned wooden crate that had served as a seat for as long as the loft had stood. The crate was of the same elm wood as the inside bench, its slats bleached by sun and rain to a pale driftwood grey, its surface worn smooth where generations of bodies had rested. He settled onto it with a low exhalation, his back finding the familiar support of the sun-heated planks, and stretched his legs out in front of him, the leather of his boots dusty now from the morning's work. The wood of the crate was so warm that he could feel it through his wool trousers, a deep, dry, soaking warmth that loosened the small muscles of his lower back and shoulders. He placed the cloth bundle on his lap and unfolded it with slow, deliberate movements, revealing the simple food that had been wrapped inside since before dawn. There was a thick slice of brown bread, its crust dark and floury, the crumb dense and chewy and speckled with the small, nutty grains of cracked wheat that the village baker always added. Beside it lay a wedge of pale cheese, a young cheese made from the milk of the farm just beyond the church. Its texture smooth and slightly springy, its color the creamy white of fresh milk, with a few small round holes where air had been trapped during the pressing. A small firm onion, no larger than a hen's egg, sat next to the cheese, its papery outer skin a glossy amber brown that flaked away at the touch. There was nothing else, no butter, no salt, no extra wrapping, just the three simple items arranged on the clean linen, and that was exactly enough. He ate slowly, as he always ate at noon, not from any conscious discipline, but because the rhythm of the loft had seeped into everything, and haste had no place here. He tore the bread with his fingers, the crust resisting for a moment and then giving way with a soft, satisfying crackle, and he placed a small piece in his mouth, chewing it thoroughly before taking the next. The bread tasted of the wheat fields that grew in the high ground above the village, of the stone-ground flour and the wood-fired oven, of the long, patient rising of the dough in the small hours. He broke off a corner of the cheese and ate it with the bread, the cool, mild creaminess cutting the density of the crumb, the two flavors blending into something warm and sustaining. The onion he ate in small, crisp bites, the sharp, sweet juice clearing his mouth and leaving a faint, pleasant sting on his tongue. And between bites he wiped his fingers on the edge of the cloth to keep them clean. While he ate, he watched the pigeons that had come out of the loft to take their own midday refreshment. A shallow terracotta pan, wide and low, had been set in a sunny patch of bare earth a few yards from the south wall, filled that morning with clean water from the rain barrel. It was the birds' bathing pan, and a dozen pigeons had gathered around it, their feathers puffed and their wings held slightly away from their bodies in the warmth of the sun. The bathing had begun as a single bird, a young blue hen, stepped cautiously into the water, tested it with a quick, trembling shake of her foot, and then lowered her whole body into the shallow pool. The water came only to her breast, and she sat in it with a look of intense, serious concentration, her eyes half closed, and then she began to splash with rapid, vibrating wing beats that sent droplets flying in all directions. Other birds joined her, stepping into the pan one by one until the water was alive with their movement. They splashed and ruffled, dunking their heads and shaking them violently, the water spraying up in brief, sparking arcs that caught the sunlight like scattered glass. The sound of their bathing was a light, busy, splashing noise, mixed with the dry flapping of wings as they rose up on the spot and then settled again. And now and then a bird would hop out of the pan onto the warm earth and stand with its wings held out stiffly, the feathers all on end, while the water ran off it in small rivulets. The wet pigeons looked thin and almost ridiculous, their feathers plastered down to show the true shape of their bodies, and then they would shake themselves in a single, violent, all-over shudder that restored their fluffiness and sent a fine mist into the air. The keeper watched this with the bread still in his hand, chewing slowly, his mind not forming any particular thoughts but simply resting on the pleasant sight of the bathing birds. The splashing and the soaking and the shaking went on for a long time, the same sequence repeated by bird after bird, and the water in the terracotta pan grew gradually cloudier and lower. Some of it splashed out onto the ground where it made small dark spots that dried quickly in the sun. The pigeons that had finished bathing gathered in a loose cluster on the warm grass, preening their wet feathers with long, careful strokes of their beaks, working the water through each barb and vein until every feather lay flat and clean. The air in the bathing pan smelled of wet bird, a warm, slightly dusty, clean smell that mingled with the scent of the sun-heated wood and the distant sweetness of the meadow. The village beyond the meadow was entirely silent at this hour, its own midday rest in full sway. The distant blacksmith's hammer, which had been ringing at irregular intervals through the late morning, had fallen quiet, as if the smith himself had put down his tools and found a patch of shade. For a long stretch, there was no sound at all except the splashing of the pigeons and the soft, dry scrape of the keeper's boots against the dirt as he shifted his position on the crate. Then, far off, the hammer struck 3 times in slow, even succession. the clangs reaching him across the fields as thin, bell-like notes that hung in the still air for a moment and then faded. The blacksmith was perhaps mending a plowshare or shaping a shoe, his work continuing even in the noon pause, but the sound came to the keeper as a distant, abstract punctuation, 3 full stops in the long sentence of the day. A moment after the third clang had died away, the single bell of the village church rang out, a single, clear, bronze note that rose and fell and rose again, marking the hour of noon with the same voice it had used for centuries. The note was not loud, but it travelled far, carried on the still, dense air, and it seemed to roll across the meadow like a slow, invisible wave, touching the loft and the bathing pan and the grazing sheep in the far pasture, and then passing on into the quiet beyond. The keeper listened to it without moving, the bread held loosely in his fingers, and when the sound had completely faded, he took another bite and chewed it in the new silence that followed. The church bell had no urgency. It was merely a measurement, a gentle reminder that time was passing, though it passed so slowly here that the reminder felt almost unnecessary. From somewhere in the village, a rooster crowed, a single hoarse rising cry that stretched out and then broke off abruptly, as if the bird had remembered that it was noon and not dawn and had stopped itself mid-call. No other rooster answered it, and the silence closed back over the sound like water over a dropped stone. A few sparrows chittered briefly in the alders by the meadow's edge, a quick, busy exchange of small, sharp notes that was over almost before it began, and then they too fell quiet. The whole world seemed to be holding its breath, resting in the flat, white heat of the early afternoon, and the keeper felt himself part of that rest, his body still and his breathing slow and deep. He finished the bread and the cheese, saving the last small piece of onion for the final bite, its sharp taste clearing the lingering floweriness from his mouth. Then he folded the cloth carefully, corner to corner, and brushed the crumbs from his lap, watching them fall onto the dusty ground where small ants would find them and carry them away. The cloth he tucked back under his arm, and he leaned his head against the warm wall of the loft, feeling the stored heat seep through his hair and into his scalp. His eyelids grew heavy, not with the weight of true sleep, but with the pleasant drowsiness that comes from a full stomach and a quiet mind, and he let them close for a moment, just a moment, while the sun pressed gently against his face and the pigeons finished their bathing in soft, splashing murmurs. The south wall held the heat like a stone oven, and the keeper dozed in the way that a man dozes when he does not fully sleep but simply drifts, aware of his surroundings but not attentive to them. He heard the pigeons without hearing them, the water sounds merging with the distant hum of bees in the clover beyond the fence, a low, continuous, furry drone that was the very voice of summer. A light breeze stirred for the first time that day, just enough to move the hair on his forehead and to carry the scent of the linden trees from the churchyard. A sweet, almost honeyed fragrance that reminded him of the blooming June of his childhood. He breathed it in and out and in again, and the moments passed without any mark or measure. When he opened his eyes, the sun had shifted just enough to cast a thin line of shadow along the base of the south wall, the shadow of a single blade of grass that had grown tall beside the crate, and now leaned over to touch the wood. The pigeons had finished their bathing and were now scattered across the grass, some standing on one leg with their heads tucked back, others lying on their bellies with their wings spread out to dry, their feathers fluffed to catch every particle of warmth. The terracotta pan was nearly empty, the water inside it now a thin, murky film that glinted with a dull metallic reflection, and a single floating feather, white and downy, drifted slowly in a circle in the middle of it. Everything was quiet, still, and deeply, utterly calm. The keeper sat up a little straighter on the crate, not because he had to move, but because his body had rested enough and was now ready for the slower rhythms of the afternoon. He did not hurry, he simply let the drowsiness drain out of him gradually, like water from a tilted bowl, and he sat for a while longer in the sun, watching the meadow and the sky and the birds. The afternoon would bring its own tasks, the training observations and the ledger entries, and the quiet work of checking bands and feathers. But those tasks were still a little way ahead, and he saw no need to rush toward them. The midday rest was as much a part of the day's rhythm as the sweeping or the grain, and he gave it its full, slow measure. Sitting on the upturned crate with the warm wood at his back, and the church bell's echo still lingering somewhere in the quiet air, The midday rest drifted to its natural end as the sun slipped a fraction past its zenith, and the shadows under the loft eaves began to lengthen by no more than a finger's width. The keeper sat a while longer on the upturned crate, feeling the stored warmth of the south wall radiate through his back, and then he stirred, lifting his shoulders in a slow, easy stretch that pulled the cloth of his jacket tight across his arms before relaxing again. The pigeons that had bathed in the terracotta pan were now dry and preened, their feathers glossy and full, and most of them had returned to the loft through the open door to doze on their clean perches. A few remained out on the grass, standing motionless on one leg with the sun beating down on their grey backs, and the keeper watched them for a moment longer before he stood up, brushed the last crumbs from his trousers, and walked back inside. The interior of the loft had grown noticeably warmer, the air thick with the dry heat that built up under the tiled roof, and the mingled body warmth of the pigeons. The smell of cedar and straw had intensified, as if the heat were drawing it out of the wood, and the dust motes in the sunbeams seemed to move more slowly, suspended in the dense air like tiny flecks of gold leaf. The keeper crossed to the bench and took up the cloth-bound ledger that sat on the shelf beside the ring box. A book of heavy, cream-colored pages sewn between covers of stiff card that had been wrapped in the same sarge fabric as his jacket. The ledger was perhaps 3/4 filled, its pages soft and slightly wavy from the humidity of many summers, and the pencil stub tucked into the spine was worn down to a nub that fit perfectly into the curve between his thumb and forefinger. He set the ledger on the bench and opened it to the current page, smoothing it flat with a slow pass of his hand, and then he walked to the far end of the loft, where the trapdoor was built into the gable wall. The trap was a rectangular opening cut into the timber about waist-high, fitted with a sliding panel of wood that ran in greased grooves and could be raised or lowered by a simple cord and pulley mechanism made of iron. At the moment the panel was closed, its surface flush with the inner wall, and a small wooden wedge jammed into the groove to hold it in place against any nighttime predator that might test the outside edge. The keeper removed the wedge and set it on the floor, then grasped the cord, which was a length of smooth, worn hemp that passed through a pulley block screwed to the beam above. He pulled down with a slow, steady pressure, and the panel rose in its grooves, with a soft, rumbling sound, the wood sliding against wood with the ease that came from years of careful use and regular greasing. As the panel lifted, the outside world appeared in a widening horizontal strip. First the pale, dusty earth below the loft, then the lower edge of the landing board, then the full width of the meadow beyond, and finally the sky, a broad band of washed-out blue that seemed impossibly bright after the dim interior. The landing board was a wide, flat plank of weathered oak that jutted out from the trap opening like a small balcony, its surface roughened for grip, and its outer edge fitted with a low rail to give the birds a secure place to alight. Below it, the ground fell away in a gentle slope of short-cropped grass, and beyond that, the meadow stretched to the distant hedge. The keeper leaned forward through the opening, bracing one hand on the sill, and checked that the landing board was clear of droppings and debris, that no spider had spun a web across the opening during the morning. A light, warm breeze came through the trap, carrying the scent of dry grass and clover, and it stirred the air inside the loft, causing a few loose feathers to lift from the floor and tumble gently along the aisle. The racing squad was housed in a separate flight pen on the west side of the loft, a larger enclosure with its own door that opened directly onto the landing board. The keeper walked to this pen now and unlatched its door, swinging it wide and stepping back to let the birds decide their own moment. The racers were a mixed group of mature cocks and hens, the birds that had been bred and trained for distance flying, their bodies sleeker than the others, their wings longer, their eyes brighter and more watchful. They had been resting through the morning, and now, as the door opened and the fresh air flowed in, they stirred with a rustle of wing feathers, their heads lifting, their feet shifting on the perches. The first bird to step down was the veteran blue-bar cock that had won the long race the previous season. A bird of notable confidence and calm, and it walked with unhurried dignity across the floor, hopped up to the landing board, and stood there for a moment, surveying the meadow with quick, sharp turns of its head. Then it spread its wings, a wide, beautiful span of slate-grey and black barring, and launched itself into the air with a single hard downstroke that made a clapping sound like a book being shut. Other birds followed, one after another, stepping through the pen door and onto the landing board in a quiet procession. Some of the younger racers hesitated for a few seconds at the threshold, looking out at the bright world with a quick, nervous tilting of the head, and then they too jumped forward and took flight. The sound of their wings filled the air, a rhythm of sharp, percussive beats that accelerated as each bird rose, the claps overlapping and merging into a short, intense burst of noise that faded as the birds gained height. Within a minute, the entire racing squad was airborne, 15 birds rising in a loose, drifting column that spiraled upward and outward, their wings beating hard at first and then, as they reached their chosen altitude, shifting to a more leisurely, soaring rhythm. The keeper stood at the open trap, leaning one shoulder against the frame, and watched them climb. The birds formed a wide, irregular circle above the meadow, their bodies dark against the pale sky, and as they circled, they tilted in unison, their wings catching the sunlight and flashing white as the undersides turned toward him. The pattern of their flight was familiar and beautiful, a broad, sweeping loop that took them out over the alder stand, then back over the loft, then out toward the village, their circle widening gradually as they tested the edges of their familiar air. The flock moved like a single fluid shape, expanding and contracting as individuals made small adjustments, and the keeper followed them with his eyes, squinting slightly against the brightness, feeling the sun hot on his cheeks and the back of his neck. After the birds had been aloft for a few minutes, the keeper reached into his jacket pocket and took out his tin pocket watch. The watch was an old one, its silver case scratched and worn from decades of being held unopened, its white enamel dial showing the hours in thin, spidery Roman numerals. He pressed the catch, and the lid sprang open with a small, crisp click, revealing the hands, which stood at 2:15. He noted the position, closed the watch, and slipped it back into his pocket, and then he leaned forward on the sill, resting his forearms on the warm wood, and settled into the steady, patient observation that was the heart of the afternoon training. The birds were flying high now, several hundred feet up, their dark silhouettes sliding across the blue-white canvas of the sky, with a grace that made them seem almost motionless. They wheeled and turned, their wings held stiff and steady between occasional wing beats, and the keeper watched the way the flock held its shape, how the birds stayed close without crowding, how the younger flyers kept to the middle while the older ones took the outer edges where the wind was stronger. Everything he saw was information that would shape the training in the weeks ahead, the distance of the tosses, the timing of the races, the selection of the first birds to ship for the opening meet, and he absorbed it without writing anything down, letting his eyes do the recording. From time to time, the flock would disappear behind the high white cloud that hung in the northern sky, a single, solitary cloud that had drifted in from somewhere over the sea and now sat on the horizon like a mound of cream. When the birds passed behind it, they were swallowed utterly, their dark shapes vanishing into the white glare, and then, after an interval of stillness, they would emerge on the other side, tiny specks reappearing one by one, and the keeper would feel a quiet, wordless relief that was less a thought than a bodily sensation. He watched this happen several times, the disappearance and the reappearance, and each time he noted the approximate number of birds and the speed of their exit from the cloud's shadow. After a while, he straightened up from the sill, walked back to the bench, and opened the ledger. He took the pencil stub in his fingers, his grip light and precise, and he wrote on the page in small, neat letters. The entry recorded the time the birds had been released, their number, the condition of the sky, and a brief note on their behavior. 2.17. Squad of 15 out. Strong climb, tight circle. High and wide after 5 minutes. Cloud cover to north, birds passing through cleanly. The pencil made a faint, scratchy sound on the paper, a dry, pleasant sound that seemed to belong to the quiet of the loft. And when he had finished writing, he set the pencil down and walked back to the trap to continue watching. The flock had begun to descend now, their circle tightening and dropping, the birds coming down in a long, shallow spiral that brought them closer with each pass. Their flight was faster on the descent, their wings beating more often, and the sound of them drifted down to the keeper as a soft, rhythmic whisper. He watched the angle of their wings, the way they cupped the air to slow themselves, and he noted that the young blue hen that had been hesitant at the trapdoor was now flying near the front, her movements confident and sure. This was what the afternoon training was for, not just exercise, but the building of trust between the bird and the sky, the slow, repeated teaching of the route home. When the first bird reached the landing board, It came in with a rush of air and a rapid backbeating of wings that brought it to a perfect standstill just above the wood, its feet reaching down and gripping the edge in a single, clean motion. It was the veteran blue barcock, as it always was, and it stood on the board for a moment with its chest heaving, its feathers slightly ruffled from the flight, and then it hopped down through the trap and walked with a brisk, important stride toward the drinking fountain. Other birds followed in quick succession, their landings making a series of soft thuds and rustles, and soon the landing board was crowded with pigeons, each one waiting its turn to enter the loft. The keeper stood back from the trap, giving them room, and watched as the racing squad returned to their pen, their bodies glowing with the heat and exertion of the flight. He looked at his watch again, pressing the catch and noting the time. 52 minutes had passed since the first bird had launched. He walked to the bench and wrote in the ledger below the earlier entry, landed 3:09, total time aloft 52 minutes. All 15 returned. Good condition, no stragglers. The pencil moved across the page in its quiet, precise way, and then he closed the ledger and set it back on the shelf, the day's record complete. Outside, the sky was still and blue. The single cloud had drifted further north, and the meadow lay in the heavy golden light of late afternoon. The keeper stood in the doorway, looking out at the quiet world, and he let the slow satisfaction of the completed training settle into him, a feeling as calm and steady as the breath moving in and out of his lungs. The afternoon had thinned into a long golden stillness, the sun sliding down the western sky with the slow, measured pace of a weight descending a well, and the light that fell through the high slats of the loft had changed from the white glare of noon to a deeper, richer color, like honey poured slowly into tea. The keeper, who had spent the middle hours observing the training flights and recording his small, careful notes in the ledger, now felt the day beginning to turn toward its close, and he moved through the loft with the particular quietness of evening, a quietness that was different from the quietness of morning because it was the quietness of putting things to rest rather than of waking them. He began his final walk-through at the back wall, where the old nest boxes sat in their ordered rows, and he worked his way slowly toward the door, his eyes moving from floor to perch to ceiling in a gentle, habitual sweep that missed nothing. The drinking fountains were the first thing he checked, because water was the simplest and most essential kindness he could offer the birds before the long night. The 4 glazed clay fountains stood on the bench, their surfaces catching the low, slanting light and holding it in soft, warm highlights along their rims. He lifted each one in turn, feeling its weight to judge how much water remained. The birds had drunk steadily through the afternoon, and the levels had dropped by perhaps a third overall, the waterline now visible as a faint, pale ring on the cream interior glaze. He carried the fountains one at a time out to the tap, emptied the small amount of old water that remained onto the grass where the ground was now thoroughly soaked from the day's many small pourings, and rinsed each vessel with a quick swirl of fresh rainwater before refilling it to the brim. The water from the barrel was still cool despite the heat of the day, the rain barrel having been shaded all afternoon by the alders that grew along the meadow's edge, and it splashed into the fountains with a clean, bright sound. When all 4 fountains were full and back in their places on the bench, their water gleaming with the captured light of the sunset, he ran his finger along each rim to catch any stray droplet that might attract a curious ant in the night. The feeding troughs had been empty since the morning's meal, the birds having picked them clean to the last split pea, and the keeper saw no need to fill them again now. The grain they had eaten would sustain them until morning, for pigeons do not feed in the dark. But there were always a few birds, who for reasons known only to themselves, liked to pick at something just before roosting, and so he took a small handful of the mixed grain from the burlap sack, no more than a dozen kernels of maize and a few peas and a scattering of wheat, and he scattered it lightly across the floorboards near the door, where the late eaters could find it without disturbing their neighbors. The grain fell with a soft, tapping rain, and almost immediately an old blue hen who had been watching him from the lowest perch fluttered down and began to peck at the offering, her head bobbing in the slow, contented rhythm of a bird who was not hungry but simply enjoyed the taste. The floorboards were still clean from the morning's sweeping, but a day of living had left its small, inevitable traces. A downy feather here, a fleck of dried droppings where a bird had shifted on its perch, a tiny scatter of chaff from a nest box where a sitting hen had rearranged her straw. The keeper picked up the feather, a soft, pale grey oval no larger than a child's thumbnail, and placed it in the jar on the windowsill where he collected the best of the day's shed down for cleaning the ledger pages. He took the birch broom from its corner and made a light, quick pass over the floor, not the thorough, dampened sweep of the morning, but a dry, gentle brushing that gathered the day's small debris into a tiny pile that he scooped up with his hand and tossed out the door onto the grass. The floorboards after this light sweeping looked almost exactly as they had before, but the small ritual of tidying satisfied something in him, a sense that the loft should be as orderly at night as it had been at dawn. Now he turned his attention to the sliding shutters, the small rectangular vents that ran along both long walls just under the eaves, each one a wooden panel set into a groove that allowed it to slide back and forth across the ventilation opening. The shutters were the loft's main defense against the small, sharp-toothed predators that hunted in the dark, the weasels and stoats that could slip through a gap no wider than a thumb, the foxes that dug under loose boards, the owls that sometimes struck at roosting birds through open slits. The keeper began at the east wall, at the shutter nearest the back corner, and he worked his way toward the front, sliding each panel across its opening with a firm, even pressure. The wood of the shutters was old cedar, like the perches, and it moved in its grooves with a smooth, quiet whisper, the sound of two surfaces that had been shaped to fit each other perfectly and had been polished by years of this same motion. Each shutter settled into its closed position with a soft, definite thud, and the keeper tested each one by pressing his thumb against the lower edge, checking that it had seated fully and would not slide open again in the night. The west wall shutters were closed in the same careful sequence, and as each one slid into place, the light in the loft changed. The long golden beams that had been streaming through the slats were cut off one by one, and the interior grew dimmer and softer, the shadows deepening from grey to charcoal, the colours of the perches and nest boxes muting from their daylight brightness into a uniform, dusky brown. By the time the last shutter was closed, the loft was lit only by the open door and by the faint, diffuse glow that seeped through the cracks between the planks, a light that was more the memory of light than light itself. The air inside grew stiller, warmer, more enclosed, and the pigeons, sensing the change, settled more deeply onto their perches, their cooing dropping to a low, barely audible murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The keeper paused in the aisle, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness, and he looked along the rows of birds with the same careful attention he had given them in the morning. Each pigeon was in its place, its shape a soft rounded silhouette against the darker wood of the wall. Some had already tucked their heads back into the feathers between their wings, the classic sleeping posture that made them look like small perfect sculptures of grey stone. Others were still awake, their eyes catching the last light from the doorway in tiny bright points of orange and gold that seemed to float in the shadows. The keeper counted them by sight, not by number, but by position, confirming that the dark checker was on his usual perch at the end of the top row, that the mealy hen was still on her eggs in her nest box, that the young blues were clustered together on the third row as they always were. Every bird was accounted for, every perch was filled, and the quiet order of the loft was complete. He walked to the door and stood for a moment on the threshold, looking back into the dim, warm interior one last time. The scent of the loft at evening was different from its morning scent. The clean, sharp note of the soap had faded, and the fresh, cool water smell had softened, leaving only the deep, permanent smells of old wood, dry straw, and the warm, dusty, living presence of the birds. It was the smell of shelter, of safety, of a long night's rest in a place that had been made for that exact purpose. And the keeper breathed it in with the same quiet satisfaction he had felt at dawn. A satisfaction that was now tinged with the gentle fatigue of a day fully lived. He stepped outside, the cool evening air touching his face after the warmth of the loft, and he put his hand on the edge of the heavy wooden door. The door swung inward on its iron hinges with the same soft scrape it had made that morning, but now the sound was a closing rather than an opening, a note that descended rather than rose. He guided it gently into its frame, feeling the edges meet with a solid, satisfying contact. And then he slid the wooden bolt across from the outside, the bolt moving with a low, smooth groan that had been part of the loft's nightly music for as long as anyone could remember. The bolt seated itself in its iron catch with a definitive plunk, a sound that meant the birds were secure, the work was done, and the loft was closed. He did not leave immediately. He stood beside the closed door, his hand still resting on the bolt, and he listened. From inside the loft came the softest possible sounds, muffled now by the thick plank walls, the tiny scratch of a claw adjusting its grip, the brief flutter of wings as a bird resettled, and underneath it all the low, continuous thrumming murmur of pigeons settling into sleep. The sound was so faint that he felt it as much as heard it, a gentle vibration in the wood under his hand, the collective breath of the loft slowing into the rhythm of the night. Beyond the loft, the meadow was darkening, the grass turning from gold to grey as the last sunlight drained from the sky, and the first bats were flickering high overhead, their wings making no sound at all. The air smelled of cool earth and distant wood smoke, and the faint, sweet perfume of the linden trees by the churchyard, a scent that seemed to gather all the peace of the village into a single, quiet breath. He tested the bolt once more, tugging it gently with 2 fingers to be certain it was securely seated, and the solid resistance of the iron against the wood told him everything he needed to know. Then he turned away from the loft and began to walk the grassy track that led back toward the village, his boots making the same soft, dry sound on the path that they had made that morning, though now the sound seemed slower, heavier, weighted with the day's completed work. The sky ahead of him was a pale, fading apricot, the color of a ripe fruit just before it falls, and the smoke from the village chimneys rose straight up into it, thin columns of silver grey that merged with the dusk. Behind him, the loft sat in the gathering darkness, a long, low shape against the darker line of the alders, and inside it the pigeons slept, their heads tucked back, their feathers fluffed, their tiny hearts beating in the slow, steady rhythm of the long summer night. The keeper stood for a long moment beside the closed door of the loft, his palm still resting on the iron bolt that held the night secure. The meadow before him had lost the last of its afternoon gold, and was now a soft, muted grey-green, the individual blades of grass blending together into a single, even texture like the nap of old velvet. Above, the sky had shifted through several quiet colors, from pale blue to a wash of lemon, then to a thin, watery apricot that seemed to glow without a source, as if the light were coming from the air itself. He let his breath settle into the rhythm of the dusk, feeling the tiredness in his legs and the pleasant ache in his lower back. And then he turned away from the loft and began to walk the track that led back to the village. The path was the same path he had walked that morning, but evening had changed it entirely. In the morning it had been a lane of cool grey mist and closed shutters, a place of quiet anticipation. Now it was a lane of soft, settled shadow, and the day's last warmth rising from the packed earth. His boots made a low, regular sound on the grass, and then, as he reached the cobbled lane beyond the churchyard, a firmer, cleaner sound on the worn stones, a sound that seemed to measure his progress in slow, even beats. He walked without hurry, his hands loose at his sides, and he let his gaze move from one familiar thing to another, noting the small changes that the afternoon had wrought since he had passed this way before. The linden trees by the churchyard gate were still in full leaf, their broad, heart-shaped leaves now dark against the apricot sky, and the sweet honeyed scent that had been faint in the morning had strengthened with the warmth of the day, drifting across the lane in soft, invisible waves. The church beyond them was no longer a dark mass in the fog, but a quiet, solid shape of pale stone, its tower catching the last light on its western face, so that the old grey blocks seemed almost golden. No bell rang now. The noon bell had rung hours ago, and the evening bell would not sound until the light was fully gone. The lane curved past the churchyard and straightened out between the first cottages, and here the keeper began to see the small signs of the village settling into its own evening. A few windows had been unshuttered now that the heat of the day was past, and through the small, square panes of thick glass he could see the soft, wavering glow of oil lamps being lit. The light from these lamps was a warm amber color, entirely unlike the white light of the sun, and it fell in small bright patches onto the cobblestones outside, making rectangles of warmth on the cool stone. In one window he saw the silhouette of a woman moving slowly from table to hearth, and in another, the darker shape of a man sitting in a chair, his head bent as if reading. No sounds came from these houses except the faint, occasional clink of a pot, or the low murmur of voices that were too soft to carry beyond the walls. Smoke rose from every chimney, thin, straight columns of silver grey that climbed into the still evening air, and then, at a certain height, blurred and spread and disappeared. The smoke smelled of burning wood, mostly beech and birch from the managed coppice beyond the village, and it carried with it the faint, savoury notes of the evening meals being prepared within. The keeper walked past a cottage whose open kitchen door let out a strong, warm scent of stewed leeks and barley, a smell that was both rich and simple, and it reminded him that he had eaten nothing since his midday bread and cheese. His stomach gave a small, quiet response, but he did not quicken his pace. The walk was its own kind of nourishment, and the village was not large. The lane widened slightly where it passed the wheelwright's yard, a small open space of packed earth and scattered wood shavings that smelled of cut elm and pine resin, even in the dark. The wheelwright's workshop was a low, open-fronted building with a wide overhang, and under the overhang sat a finished cart waiting for its owner to collect it the next day, its wheels new and pale, its iron fittings gleaming faintly in the dusk. In the bed of the cart, curled into a tight, round shape, a dog was sleeping. It was a farm dog of no particular breed, its coat a rough, brownish grey, and it lay with its nose tucked under its tail, and its sides rising and falling in the deep, slow rhythm of an animal that was utterly at peace. The keeper walked past the cart without breaking stride, and the dog did not stir. Perhaps its ear twitched once, a tiny movement that was over almost before it began, and then it was still again. The only sound from the yard was the faint, regular whisper of the dog's breathing, a sound so soft that it blended with the other evening sounds until it was barely distinguishable from the silence itself. After the wheelwright's yard, the lane narrowed again, and curved past the small square building that served as the village shop, its broad front window now covered with a heavy wooden shutter that had been padlocked for the night. A cat sat on the doorstep, a lean, black creature with pale green eyes that reflected the lamplight from the cottage opposite in two tiny bright points. The cat watched the keeper pass with the detached, unblinking gaze of its kind, and then it yawned, showing a pink mouth and a curl of tongue, and began to wash one paw with slow, deliberate strokes. The keeper nodded to the cat, a small, almost imperceptible inclination of his chin, and walked on. The lane became a gentle slope as it approached the baker's yard, and here the smell of the morning's baking had been replaced by the cooler, cleaner scent of scrub stone and cooling ovens. The baker's door was closed, and a thin line of light showed at its bottom edge, but no sound came from within. The baker had finished his work hours ago, and was now, perhaps, sitting in his kitchen with his own family, his hands smelling of flour and yeast. The keeper passed the yard and came to the well, its wooden cover still clamped down for the night, and he paused here for a moment to look back over the route he had walked. The lane behind him was now a dark, quiet tunnel of shadow between the cottages, with only the occasional square of lamplight to show where people were. The sky above it had deepened from apricot to a soft, bruised rose, and the first stars were just beginning to appear, tiny, faint points of light that were there and then, as he looked directly at them, seemed to disappear. He turned back and continued on, his boots making the same steady, unhurried sound on the stones. The keeper's cottage stood at the end of the lane, a small brick building with a low, tiled roof and a single square window that was now dark. It was set back slightly from the lane, with a narrow strip of packed earth between the doorstep and the cobblestones, and in this strip grew a few clumps of lavender that the keeper's mother had planted many years ago, and that still bloomed faithfully every summer, their grey-green leaves and purple flowers now a soft, shadowy blur in the dusk. The scent of the lavender was faint but distinct, a clean, sharp, herbal note that cut through the heavier smells of wood smoke and cooking, and the keeper paused beside it, brushing his fingers lightly over the tops of the flowers, so that the scent rose up fresh and strong. It was a small, private gesture, a greeting and a closing, and he did it every evening without ever quite deciding to. He stepped up to the cottage door and paused on the threshold, lifting one boot and then the other to knock the dried mud from the soles against the iron boot scrape that was set into the stone step. The mud fell away in small crumbling pieces, the light, dry dust of the meadow path and the darker, finer soil from the lane, and it scattered onto the stone where the next rain would wash it away. When his boots were clean enough, he pushed open the door, which was never locked, and stepped inside. The interior of the cottage was dark and still, the only light coming from the faint glow of the sky through the square window and from the low embers that still glowed in the hearth. The keeper crossed the room to the hearth, his feet finding their way by memory over the wide plank floor, and he knelt down before the fire to place a few small pieces of kindling onto the embers. The kindling caught with a soft, crackling sound, and small flames began to lick upward, casting a warm orange light over the simple room. The walls were whitewashed and bare except for a single framed photograph on the mantelpiece and a small wooden cross that hung above the door. The furniture was plain: a table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner with its blanket folded back, the washstand with its glazed bowl and pitcher. Everything was in its place, just as it had been when he left in the morning, and the room smelled of cold ash, dried lavender, and the faint, clean scent of the whitewash. He lit the oil lamp on the table, striking a match and touching it to the wick so that the flame steadied into a small bright globe of light that pushed the shadows back into the corners. Then he sat down on one of the wooden chairs, unlacing his boots with slow, tired fingers and pulling them off one at a time, setting them beside the door where they would wait for the morning. His feet in their thick wool socks were warm and slightly damp from the day's walking, and he stretched them out toward the hearth, feeling the heat of the new fire begin to soak into the sore muscles of his arches and heels. He sat there for a while, not thinking anything in particular, just letting the quiet of the cottage settle around him. After some time, he rose and went to the small pantry cupboard beside the hearth, where he found a heel of bread and a piece of hard cheese wrapped in a cloth. He ate these standing at the window, looking out at the lane, which was now entirely dark except for the squares of lamplight from the other cottages. The stars had come out fully, hundreds of them, a faint scattered dusting of light across the deep blue-black of the sky, and a thin crescent moon had risen above the church tower, its light so faint that it cast no shadows. The village was folding itself into the night, and the only sounds were the distant, rhythmic chirp of crickets in the meadow, and the soft, constant whisper of the fire behind him. When he had finished eating, he washed his hands and face at the washstand, the water cool and clean against his skin, and he dried them on the linen cloth. He undressed slowly, folding his clothes over the back of the chair, and pulled on a clean, soft nightshirt that smelled of the sun from being dried on the line. He crossed to the bed, pulled back the blanket, and lay down, feeling the straw-filled mattress shift and settle under his weight. The bed was narrow but comfortable, and the pillow smelled of the same dry straw as the loft, a scent that followed him even here. He lay on his back, looking up at the dark ceiling beams, and he listened to the night. The fire made a low, ticking sound as the wood cooled and settled. Outside, the crickets sang their steady, unchanging song. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once and was silent, and behind all these sounds, quieter than any of them, was the slow, deep, peaceful silence of the village, asleep, a silence that stretched across the fields and the meadows and the dark lane, all the way to the loft at the edge of the meadow. In that loft, the pigeons were sleeping on their clean perches, their heads tucked back, their feathers fluffed, their tiny crops full of the day's grain. They would stir once or twice in the night, shifting their feet, murmuring a single low coo in their dreams, and then settle again into stillness. The keeper closed his eyes. His breathing slowed and deepened, falling into the same steady rhythm as the pigeons in their loft, as the dog in the cart, as the baker and the wheelwright and the woman at her hearth. The last thought that drifted through his mind before sleep took him was not a thought at all, but an image. The dark shape of the loft against the starry sky, the bolt secure, the birds at peace, the meadow quiet in the summer dark. Then the image faded, and there was only the soft, even whisper of his breathing, and the night moved on without him, carrying the village and the meadow and the sleeping loft into another dawn.